What happens when you send untrained and inexperienced American troops into a raging European warfront, a battle that would catapult a formerly isolationist nation onto the world stage? The US of the early 20th century wasn't the US of today, and let's put things into perspective. It was still considered a fledgling nation that focused on isolationist policies. It was also balancing Industrial Revolution growth against a deep schism caused by the Civil War in the mid-19th century. With this in mind, it's little surprise that many of the European powers did not consider the United States' entrance into World War I a major game changer. In fact, the Library of Congress noted that the sum of the armed forces included just 127,000 Army soldiers, along with slightly more in the National Guard. As far as numbers, that put the US in league with smaller countries like Portugal in regard to strength. Though the United States may have started with a relatively small amount of troops, the numbers quickly grew thanks to widespread enthusiasm to enlist, as well as the draft. By the end of the war, the US had around 3 million troops, 2/3 of whom had been drafted. But larger numbers weren't as important as experience, and American soldiers were severely lacking in that department. Meanwhile, the European powers had already been at war for nearly 4 years. They were facing a stalemate in northeastern France when the US forces arrived under the leadership of Major General John J. Blackjack Pershing. Though there were minor skirmishes in the fall of 1917, most Americans received training throughout the cold winter, and their first action in the spring of 1918. On March 21st, German General Ludendorff launched an offensive that sought to break through the Allied lines. Among the troops sent to defend the line were the American Army's 1st Division, known as the Big Red One. It was the most well-trained division that Pershing had, and leadership was hoping that the men would be able to make their mark in the Americans' first real fight of the war.
It quickly established a reputation for hard fighting, and has become one of the most effective military units of the past 100 years.
The Allied generals decided that a united force of French and American troops was needed to capture the town of Cantigny from the Germans. The location was chosen because it was elevated and thus a relatively important observational post. Moreover, Cantigny was one of the recent victories that the Germans had won and which threatened the strength of the Allied lines. The stakes were high. Though Cantigny itself was not a vital strategic position, General Pershing knew that a victory was instrumental in showing American might and helping the morale of the French and British troops. Conversely, the Germans were determined to make the battle a stinging loss that would spread the impression that the American forces were useless and incompetent. In the days before the battle, things already seemed to be going poorly for the American newcomers. A lieutenant engineer carrying important documents, including maps, had been captured and killed by the Germans. Morale was also low after General Ludendorff launched an attack that set the grounds for an invasion of Paris. Even around Cantigny, the Germans raided the Americans just hours before the planned assault, meaning soldiers were already weary and tired. Despite the action throughout the night, the offensive on Cantigny continued as planned. The battle started early in the morning, around 6:30 a.m. on May 28, 1918. The man in command of the attack was General Charles P. Summerall. According to the 1st Division Museum, the assault began with the mass bombing of the German lines. Using the smoke as cover, French tanks began to make their way toward the small town. Using the tanks as a guide, American troops then charged forward with French aid. The details were meticulously planned. The tanks and troops would advance 110 yards every 2 minutes. This was deemed the best combination of speed with cover, and the premeditated ratio was masterfully successful. Within just half an hour, Americans were using flamethrowers to dislodge the Germans from their trenches to fully secure the small town. This process ended up being nearly as fast as the charge itself, and within the hour, the Americans had taken the town in what was a striking victory. However, the battle was far from over. The Germans were not ready to give up on Cantigny without a fight, and a counterattack seemed inevitable. The Germans were quick to try to retake the small town, and the first attempt to regain Cantigny started at 8:30 a.m. that same day. The morning counterstrike was easily repelled, but the counteroffensive began in truth that afternoon, with German bombardment of the Americans with heavy artillery. This was brutal for the US forces, as they did not have the same firepower. The French artillery that was supposed to fight with the 1st Division had been sent to the Marne in response to General Ludendorff's surprise attack there. By the evening, the Allied position was considered extremely fragile. Nevertheless, the division held firm for a full 3 days. The American desire for a victory ended up being the grit needed to hold out against each new wave of bombardments. By May 31st, relief troops were able to make their way to the small French town, and the Germans were ready to admit defeat. But it was not without a price. The US troops suffered 1,603 casualties.
The fields seen in the background are those over which the American 1st Division advanced in its attacks on the German position.
The Battle of Cantigny proved to the rest of the world that the United States was no longer a sleepy backwater, but instead a major force to be reckoned with. Secondly, it also proved to Americans that they could hold their own against the Europeans, despite the fact that the continent's armies had more preparation and training than their US counterparts. In fact, the Battle of Cantigny ended up being a major point of pride and was used to shore up public goodwill towards both the war and American military might with televised reels of the assault. US competence ended up being instrumental in ending the First World War, with the German surrender on November 11, 1918.